Hey John, thanks so much for meeting me this morning.
Sure.
We are at the GSU Library on the Georgia State campus. And may I have your name, please? And please spell your last name.
Sure. My name is John Decker, Decker.
Thank you. And my name is Diana Wallace Bernstein. Today is February the 14th, 2013. And our interview is regarding your religious life story.
Great.
And do you have any preferences regarding how I refer to religion, be it religion, spirituality?
No preferences whatsoever.
Okay. So we'll begin with your childhood.
Okay.
So can you recall your earliest memory regarding religion as a child?
My earliest memory regarding religion as a child is probably... It starts at St. Anthony's Catholic Church in a little town called Manteca, California. And I remember sitting in the pew watching people do their various things, not really quite understanding what they were doing, and looking up and seeing images of what I was told were saints, and what I now know, of course, are saints, and really experiencing the space more than anything else. That's probably my earliest with that. There are lots of experiences from childhood. That's probably the earliest.
What would you say was your favorite part of the space?
I feel light. I like the light in there. Even as a kid, I liked light. And as an adult, I'm still drawn to spaces that have a lot of light in them.
Now, is it maybe have the light shown through the windows, or was it interior light?
It's the funny thing about memory from childhood. It's tinged with all kinds of weird filters.
Yes.
And I don't know that I can necessarily access that because I'm now automatically filtering it through professional categories of how I define space. So
right.
I would sound very much like a precocious 5-year-old child talking about the volume and massing of the space. So, but I think it was that it seemed light, it seemed airy, it seemed filled with space. I was busy playing with my toys. I don't think I was necessarily paying attention to what was going on. Yeah. So, and what I liked about it was, I think that now that I look back on it, it was a relatively safe space compared to what home was like.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, so that was probably refreshing then.
Indeed.
Yes. What role, if any, did religion play in your childhood?
It was a massive part of my childhood. My grandmother was born in political exile from Mexico. And so she was a very devout Spanish Catholic. My dad still is extremely religious, although I think I was 6 or 7 when we converted to Protestantism. So I always tell
that's a big difference.
I always tell my students that I went through my own Protestant rupture. I don't even use Reformation.
I was going to say, in your own household.
We had a Protestant rupture.
Rupture, okay.
Yeah, and my dad, even after that, was still quite zealous religiously. We had pictures of Christ with the Sacred Heart, even though Protestants aren't supposed to do that. You can't get the Catholic out of,
Yeah.
So that was part of it, and for my dad, it was a huge part of his life. He made us go. I had no interest in going. Didn't want to go. Right. Didn't like I'll be honest. I did not like the Protestant church as much as I liked the Catholic churches. It just had a completely different feel to it.
Do you think it was some of the maybe? Well, I don't want to put thoughts in. What do you think it was?
It was, I think, a difference in congregation. I think it was a difference. As an adult, looking back on it, I would have to say that at some point my brain was responding to the subtle social cues that are caused by differences in the rite being performed. And I think that it's also part of the maturing process. The older I got, the more aware I became of what was going on. I went from being that sort of nice, insulated child's world of here are my toys, there are people around me, it's big, it's nice, to beginning to understand what was being said, how it was being said, what the implications of it were. So I think that's a bigger part of anything else.
Right. Now, did the whole family convert? Your whole immediate family?
If by convert you mean comply with going, yes.
Okay.
It was always about compliance.
Okay.
My mother was not religious at all, had very little use for religion. My father, for his part, was a very conflicted person. He's much better now. He's much healthier, happier person now. But I think that part of that sort of authoritarianism in the forcing of religion was part of trying to manage his own conflicts and anxieties, etc. And I'm not a psychologist, so I don't want to go much further than that. I'm trying to be as charitable as possible.
Right.
And for the record, we have a very good relationship. So, it's one of those things. It's not like, oh, there's the bitter guy talking about how daddy didn't love him or something like that. So.
Yeah, no, it didn't come across that way. So, what specific religious practices do you recall participating in?
Well, during the Catholic years, I remember beginning to learn to genuflect, mostly just out of imitation of what I saw. In the Protestant years, it was a lot of, it was the Churches of Christ. And they were, the particular brand that we got stuck with, at least was instrumental, so that at least there was music, which was nice. But there were a lot of revival type things and lots of hammering the Old Testament and, all of that stuff. So, it was, I had aunts and cousins who had also converted to the same church. My Aunt Darlene, her husband wanted to go to this church, and so it was also with compliance with her too, now that I think about it. So at least I had cousins there, and so, it was a case of, we'll sit together and try to stay out of trouble.
Yeah.
So.
Did you feel more accepted at one versus the other?
I think everybody was trying to be accepting. I think as I got older, I had so many problems with what I was seeing and hearing at the Protestant church that I tend perhaps to be a bit more charitable. Also, my own scholarship deals with medieval Catholicism, so you tend to sort of love what you study. But I think a lot of it was I was beginning to really see things that disturbed me and that bothered me greatly about the belief system being espoused. And so a lot of my feelings of alienation had more to do with that internal dissonance between what I was thinking and feeling about what I was hearing and what everyone else purported to be thinking and feeling about what they were hearing. They were purporting to be accepting and to think that this was just right on and it made so much sense. And I was sort of over in the corner thinking, that contradicts that thing that you just said 5 minutes ago. I can remember being 12 and thinking, but that makes no sense. That just doesn't make sense. And the older I got, I stopped going to church at 16. When my parents divorced, my mother's like, you don't have to go to church if you don't want to. And my sister and I were like, we are never going to church again.
Done. Yeah.
But I remember from 12 to 16, every Sunday, it was a struggle to sit there and listen to this guy talking, jibber-jabbering, making no sense, contradicting himself, and using biblical precedent, using biblical verses in Scripture to back up his claims. And even as a teenager, I found myself thinking, that argument makes no sense, and it's so paper thin that you can drive a truck through it. So I think that if any feelings of not being accepted, it was that dissonance.
Now, was the minister of this church a formally trained minister?
He was what you find in most Protestant churches in the Central Valley. Somebody who had a little bit of training here and there, but he had his normal day job, and then on the weekends he was the preacher. He was replaced by a guy who had gone to Moody Bible College, and I found myself thinking that he was even worse and more contradictory than the other guy.
So that didn't help.
No, actually, I found that the guy who was more formally trained and was trying to be more clever with his exegesis was the one that least made sense, the one who was the most clearly contradictory in everything he said.
Yeah.
I kept thinking all the entire time of, here's this guy who would consider himself to be an apostolic, Christ-like preacher, but who's just like the Sadducees that Christ criticizes in the New Testament.
Tell me more about the religious background of your family.
Well, okay, my mom's side, I would call them C&E Christians at best. Not terribly religious people. They had their faith, they had their belief that there was a God and that God would take care of you, and that was pretty much the way they looked at it. Blue collar, hardworking. My grandmother was legally blind and was taught at a blind school to crochet. So she would have my grandfather pick colors for her, and sometimes he had a nasty sense of humor. Sometimes he'd just mix up colors for fun. But it was very just sort of, it was there, but it wasn't overt. My grandmother being Catholic, it was actually, she did her novenas, and she had the stand of candles that she would light for various people, and the crucifixes and the Christ of the Sacred Heart and the Virgin of Guadalupe and the whole 9 yards there. But she was even less sort of militant about religion than my dad was. My dad was hardcore about it. And I think, again, trying to manage conflicts in his own life. My uncles, so the men who married my aunts, my dad's side, it's really religions. I focus on my dad's side. My mom's side, we didn't know that well. She had a lot of siblings, but we didn't spend a lot of time with them. The uncles who married into the family were also staunchly religious as well. They've gone separate ways. One uncle has become more scientific and less religious over time. The other one has become more rabidly religious over time. So it's evolutions, I suppose.
Who would you consider to be an influential religious person in your life, in your early childhood?
Oh. That's tough. A lot of people were. I don't think I responded to people based on religion. I responded to them based on kindness. Mm-hmm. And if we look at kindness as being a byproduct of religion, there were a lot of people. But oddly enough, it was probably this little old man named Louis Laguerre. Everybody called him the Candy Man. He was 90. He had candy in his pockets all the time. And he was, at church, at the Protestant church, he would give kids candy. And it was this sort of idea of all these people who, even as a kid, I suspected were saying one thing and doing another. He was the only one who I suspect was actually doing what he said. Mm-hmm. So, that's just sort of like that kindness, that decency is, I think, what meant the most to me. Otherwise, there was really nobody who was influential in a positive way. Everybody who identified as overtly religious, I held in a fairly negative point of view because, again, their behavior didn't match their rhetoric.
Yeah. How did you... Now, this is actually a very interesting question for you. Mm-hmm. How did you identify yourself religiously as a child? So at some point, there was the change.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess my second part of that question would be, once you changed to the Protestant denomination, maybe did you still refer to yourself as a Catholic?
The funny thing is, when I was a kid, I didn't see any distinction between the two. Mm-hmm. To me, church was church. It didn't matter where it was.
Okay.
St. Anthony's was no different than the Church of Christ. It was no different to me. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think I really identified myself religiously as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, for me, religion was that thing I had to go do Sunday morning, Sunday evening. I think it was Wednesday night, or was it Thursday night? Wednesday night. It's that thing I had to go suffer through. That was how I identified
Wow.
myself in terms
Yeah.
of that.
And then how did you feel about religion as you moved out of childhood and into adolescence?
So adolescence, I had absolutely no use for religion. I had learned to pay lip service,
Mhm.
which is what I learned from the adults around me. Is that what you did? And that the way that I could keep the peer teenagers around me to be even mildly accepting was to mimic the same sort of religious sentiments that they were mimicking. But again, it was a stranger in a strange land. I mean, it was always a case of, like I said, from the time I was about 12 onward to 16, when I finally stopped going to church, it was a case of, this doesn't make any sense and I really don't belong here.
Yeah. So, do you have any specific views or beliefs religiously as a teenager that you recall?
I remember as a teenager thinking to myself that, and it's funny having to talk about this, I've spent many years of my life erasing most of this stuff.
Yeah.
I know psychologists call it repression. I call it relief.
Yeah.
But I remember thinking about religion as a teenager that it was just a gigantic hoax. That the people who actually were decent, kind people were going to be decent and kind people regardless of whether or not they went to church. And that the people who went to church and were the most vocal about being at church were some of the nastiest,
Maybe
meanest
scary.
people I knew. Yeah. When you find out that the guy who replaced the guy from Moody Bible College was accused of sexually molesting his adopted son,
There you go.
it's one of those things where you're like, oh, well, that's how I associate religion as a teenager. Fortunately, as an adult, I have a more complicated view of it, and as a scholar who deals with religion, I have a more complicated and I think a more balanced view. And I constantly tell my students we have to extend charity. Regardless of what your personal beliefs are, we must extend charity when talking about belief in religious systems.
Yes. Were there any changes or differences in your religious life between childhood and adolescence? Maybe other than you not having to go any longer once you turned at around 16?
No. I mean, it was one of those things where I think perhaps the thing that shaped me was more about what was going on in the home, and that had more to do than religion per se. And the fact that my father identified so strongly as being religious and demanded that we go to church and do religious things, and then would do the things at home that he did, I think also was what set off these sort of suspicion bells and made me automatically be primed to look for what people say and what people do.
The discrepancies there, yeah. Do you recall any pivotal moments in your religious life as a teenager?
I remember being peer pressured. There was this god-awful religious camp up in the woods that I would go to because my dad would be happy I was going to religion.
So you had to go more than once?
Oh, yeah. And he was happy because I was going because it was religious. I was happy because I was getting away from the house for a few days. And while it meant sitting around the campfire and singing ridiculously stupid religious songs, it meant not being at home, which was great. But I remember being peer pressured into one of these things where everybody goes down to the big pool, natural pool, for a good old-fashioned baptism. And I remember going, oh, well, this is what expected of me. I guess we're going to do this. And so went through all of that. And I would say that experience right there, that fundamental betrayal of myself because of how I was pressured, was very formative. I refused to betray myself anymore. I refuse to be something I'm not. I refuse to go along with something just because it's socially expected of me. So that was formative.
How old were you, maybe at the camp trip that you remember the most?
14.
14.
14. So you're at that really vulnerable stage where peer pressure is extremely important, and when it's clear that your friends are expecting it, and the camp counselors, who are the adults who are overseeing you and are judging everything you do, and who you suspect are going to give a report to your parents when you're done, make it clear that that's what they want. It's very difficult when you're 14 to say no, especially when you grew up in a household where compliance is necessary above all else.
Mm-hmm. Can you recall any significant religious figures in your adolescent years?
No, I had nothing but disdain.
At that point, there was a full shift. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, after betraying my own sense of self, I mean, I grew to actually hate religion. It went from just being confused to utterly hating it. And again, I've mediated my position. While I am not religious, I have tolerance for it, and I respect people's rights to practice whatever form of religion they want, because the last thing I want to do is force them to betray who they are.
Did you have contact with people of other religions?
No, the Central Valley of California was like growing up in 1950 Kansas. Being Catholic was exotic enough. I mean, there were no Sikhs, no Muslims, no Hindus. By the mid to late 70s, we started getting the first waves of refugees from Cambodia and Vietnam. And oddly enough, most of them had been Christianized. So we weren't even getting sort of Southeast Asian Buddhism or Southeast Asian Hinduism or Southeast Asian Islam. We were getting Southeast Asian Christianity is what we were getting.
Now, as you graduated from high school, how did you identify yourself religiously?
Atheist. Although to sound smarter than I felt I was, I would say agnostic.
Okay, now as an adult, is religion different in your life as an adult than it was when you were in high school or college?
It's an object of study.
Yeah.
It's an object of study, and because of that, I can engage with it. I can engage with it in a more meaningful and even satisfying way for me, but it still has no personal reverberation. It's just an object of study.
Okay. Have you noticed any specific moments in your life where possibly you've reflected back upon the religiosity of your life, maybe for comfort or something of such?
No. I mean, there are times when I will find myself reacting religiously. So if you remember in the news, there was a couple of mass bird die-offs for no particular reason whatsoever. And it's so funny, my first immediate visceral response was, "It's the end of days." I'm like, wait, where did that come from? Oh, right. And I will say it's funny that my scholarship, I have taught seminars on the apocalypse, on death. I work on the theology of salvation. So, I mean, it's there with me. It's transformed. But I do have these moments where I have these automatic, just sort of visceral response from that old sort of training. It's the end of day. No, it's not.
Wait a minute. Now, how would you identify yourself religiously now?
I'm a-religious. I am not so hubristic as to say agnostic, because with that statement comes the idea, but in fact, I really actually know, right? I mean, that's my problem with the category. And I don't want to say atheist either, because I tend to shy away from absolutes. I don't consider myself a seeker. I don't consider myself somebody on a spiritual journey or something like that. I think I tend to think of myself as someone who consciously tries to be as accepting of as many beliefs as possible, as long as those beliefs don't impinge on the rights of others. So I tend to be very anti-fundamentalist no matter what stripe of fundamentalism we're talking about, no matter what religious subsect we're talking about, but otherwise I try to just be live and let live.
Do you have any particularly strong memories of religion associated with Georgia State?
No, I don't, although I was so pleased to find that the religious studies department is so diverse and interesting, and I was also pleased to find that there are so many fellow UCSB alums on faculty. Mm-hmm. So for me, I've got very good associations with the religious studies department.
Yeah. How do you see yourself in comparison with other people at GSU in terms of religion?
I'd like to say probably about the same, but realistically speaking, I would probably say that I am markedly less religious, though not in that kind of obnoxious, oh, look at me, I'm avant-garde and oh so smart, so I'm not going to be religious because that's what I'm going to say I am.
Right.
But just it doesn't play a big role in my life other than as an object of study.
Do you feel do you feel well understood or misunderstood when speaking to other people at GSU regarding religion?
It doesn't really come up, but when I do, if I do make a case, well, look, it's really just an object of study for me, I think most faculty get it. What's funny is that because what I teach is so religious, you're dealing with the 15th century in Europe, right? That I constantly have to give a speech at the beginning of all my classes. I am not here to proselytize. I do not endorse any particular view. You may believe in whatever you want. And even though I say that, I will have one or two students who will look at me and say, well, in your Catholic Bible, one, I don't have a Bible of my own. Okay. Two, I don't practice any particular religion. We talk about Catholicism because that is the Christian religion in this period.
Time, right.
So it can lead to some confusion that way, but in terms of like being misunderstood, no.
Yeah. So if someone were to ask you to describe the religious environment at GSU, how would you do that? How would you describe it?
I'd say it's actually really, really tolerant. It's really open. It's one of the beauties of GSU being a diverse urban campus. That when you look around and you see people wearing large Christian crosses around their necks, or you see people wearing Stars of David. You see women wearing hijab. You see members of various Indian communities practicing various forms of Hinduism. With the little signias that kind of tell you what they're doing. I think it's this lovely mixture. I think that GSU is actually this beautiful sort of melting pot. I do think that there is a strong Christian bias, and specifically a strong Protestant bias in many of the student clubs. And that's what you would expect being in the United States. In the American South, you're going to expect, say, a strong Baptist presence, a strong Pentecostal presence. But I don't feel like it's to the detriment of the others. I would like to see there be more parity. I'd like to see that sort of Christian Protestant bias ease up a bit. But I'd have to say I'm really happy with the diversity I see.
Super. Now, are there any questions that you feel I may have missed, or something that we left out
No.
that you'd like to mention?
Not at all.
Okay. So I'll just ask you some final demographic questions. Okay, so what is your occupation?
I'm an assistant professor of the history of art and architecture.
So when and where were you born?
I was born July 13th, 1968 in a town called Manteca, California.
How would you describe your ethnicity?
I would describe it as using the various forms Hispanic/other or Latino of any race, even though I've got a German surname.
What is your educational background?
I have a doctorate.
What is your marital/partnership status?
I'm married.
How many, if any, children do you have?
No children. I'm all the child most people can handle.
And your current GSU affiliation we've covered. And what is your current religious affiliation?
None.
None. Thank you very much.
Thank you.